Hello and welcome to Fractal Time. The title of this film is Fractal Time, Mayan Dreamtime Vindicated, the True Physics of Fractality and Time. Hi everybody, I'm Dan Winter, and with me today is Jason Matozzo, who's been researching these things and will be in dialogue with us, and also he'll be featured in part 2, where we're looking at fractal time in things like Montauk and other time travel physics conversations. So today's conversation is dedicated to Jose Argüelles and the Mayan Day Out of Time, because, you know, the Mayan Day Out of Time we learned about through our friend Michel Bottineau, to whom we also dedicate this film, when he brought Jose Argüelles here to France. And we had many conversations. And, you know, the people doing the Mayan dream spell time work have created a lot of interest, especially among young people, and that's a beautiful thing. What we'd like to do here is give a solid foundation in true electrical science and physics to the notion of fractality in time, and therefore the physics of coincidence, and then to a bigger picture, which is the real physics of time travel, for example. So we have a pretty ambitious little agenda for today's conversation about the true physics of time. Now, the background here, to sort of start with basic science, let's see, we have slide number 1 in a slideshow called Fractality in Time. This is a keynote. Here we are. So we want to, in the sense of vindicating Mayan dream time, remember we just started luciddreamteam.com, which is a planetary effort to assemble teams of lucid dreamers that function as a kind of immune system for the planet, in the sense of creating a kind of police force for astral plasma or astral hygiene that is responsible not just for astral and plasma parasites and hygiene on a planetary level, but actually extraterrestrial parasitics also, that as we as a planet develop a lucid dreaming team, we become centripetal enough to actually create an astral hygiene that can eject plasma parasites, related to the story of the ETs, the Greys, the Khmer, whom Elena Dedan talks about as Nebu. So the Dreamtime was a pretty good name for fractality in time, as it was used by Jose Argüelles and the Mayan dream spell people, but also then as the Aboriginals used the term Dreamtime when they were projecting their plasma coherently down the song lines and steering these great magnetic tracks, plasma worm, the great rainbow serpent. So the plasma line that extended as a geomagnetic line right across the continent became actually kind of like a family pet. And these giant plasma lines, the so-called dreaming track song line, were in fact steered and navigated by the lucid dreaming of the Aboriginal elders, who had developed this ability to propagate this coherent, what we call longitudinal array field from their aura. We've been talking about as the Ba from the Ka, the Kesjan body, the rainbow light body, Joseph's rainbow technicolor coat. All of these are names for the coherent aura propagation of people whose aura becomes so centripetal and compressed that they can propagate this longitudinal array, the physics of lucid dreaming, and clearly how you take memory through death. And that has been the theme of our several most recent videos on the real physics of what is a soul. That when we gather a very coherent aura, we can propagate coherently. And this is all in our 300 films, our YouTube channel, 2 million views, youtube.com/danwinterfractalfield. So today, as we celebrate the Mayan quote-unquote day out of time, and when we say day out of time, we see what we actually mean is the day at the center of all spins, where in fact from that center of all spins you inhabit all of time, because you have leverage on more of the wave nodes in that array when the local spin rotations are more embed-able in the longer distance spin rotations, where the short wave is embedded correctly in the long wave by the fractal golden mean ratio, that non-destructive wave compression, caduceus, phase conjugate, perfectly fractal embeddability creates a situation where the implosion in the aura squirt guns out that coherent longitudinal electromagnetic. So that's the idea of developing the rainbow light body, and inhabiting a fractal in time gives you more leverage. And we want to make that a very practical understanding by using some very practical examples of fractality in time. And we're actually going to talk about the physics of Agnihotra in that regard. So first, we want to make a basic point. Time-space, in the sense of physics, is called a matrix, a fractal, or an array. Literally, the fractal, the fabric of time-space is conventional physics way to talk about that. And there's a reason for that, because all of space is compressed into a musical key signature called Planck length, which is directly linked to and co-defined with a unit of time called Planck time. So time and space both are linked to a fractal core musical key signature called Planck length and Planck time. And if you do golden ratio multiples times Planck length or Planck time, you get essentially the same fractal array, which is called the phase conjugate origin of negentropy, as in the title of my book. Now, inhabiting that array is to inhabit time. And the nodes of that array, so-called sacred space, are the compression nodes of this squishy ether charge which propagates as a superfluid. And the solidifying nodes of that array are what you inhabit, not just in space, but also in time. And to understand that very literally and very specifically, you would then need to know what time is. And, you know, the Einstein sort of conversation leaves most people a bit mystified on that, because they say, well, space-time is a fabric, and, you know, when you pass by a center of gravity, time is bent. And this is, in my view, a confusing language, and it should be expressed much more clearly. So let me try to say that in a much more clear and articulate way. The universe, as we know, is comprised of a single contiguous compressible media called charge. And plus and minus of that charge is the compression and rarefaction of that charge that behaves like a superfluid. That's very simple. That is a unified field, quite literally. To name the stuff of the unified field is to name the compressibility of charge. Step one. Step two, when that compressible, juicy, compressible media, when that charge rotates, it stores the inertia gyroscopically, which is the only definition and measurement of mass. So charge rotation defines mass, because that stores inertia like a gyroscope, and you measure the amount of inertia stored when charge rotates, and that's named mass. So literally, you create mass by simply rotating the compressible, juicy stuff called charge. And when that stores inertia like a gyroscope, that's called mass. So the physics of creating mass is to teach charge to rotate. It's quite simple. And then, co-defined in that process is the only definition of time, which is rate of rotation. So when that same charge started rotating, it had a period, a periodicity of rotation. And that period of rotation is named time. So time is only ever defined as rate of spin. There is nothing else. There is nothing else that could possibly define time than simply rate of rotation. Once you understand that, then this sort of mystical idea, well, if you accelerate some mass really fast toward the speed of light, the time speeds up or time slows down. What does that mean? It simply means that charge is rotating toroidally. Now, if I accelerate that toroid of charge, which has inertia called mass, if I'm accelerating, there will be some translation of vorticity where the same charge, wind of charge, that pushes that donut towards center will cause that ice skater to pull in her arms and speed up in her spin. And it's that accelerated spin rate caused by acceleration of the mass that we name the speeding up and slowing down of time. Simply rate of rotation. Once you have that well in your head, then you can begin to think accurately about things like time travel and time reversal. For example, in physics, when time reversal was first invented in phase conjugate optics, you get two lasers, they meet in perfect pine cones in a phase conjugate mirror. Think of Nostradamus and seeing the future. Because of the coating on his phase conjugate mirror scrying cup, John Dee did something similar. So the phase conjugate mirror in phase conjugate optics created time reversal only in the sense that when the two lasers met, they create implosion for the two light beams, laser beams, where the pine cones kiss noses in the phase conjugate dielectric barium strontium titanate phase conjugate mirror. Kind of think Dorothy. And at the center, the implosion was so great that when another beam of light hit the two imploding lasers at that point, that beam of light bounced off and returned to where it came from. And they call that time reversal in the sense that that beam of light went back to its origins. But most of what they mean by time reversal is negentropy, that it returned to order, because you can't time reverse toward disorder in phase conjugate optics. You can only time reverse toward order, meaning time reversal in that sense is simply mostly negentropy, self-organization. And so that then gets us closer to this idea that within that array of all those spinning wave nodes, we're going to talk about that a lot here, that leverage on that array at a distance is achievable because these longitudinal compressing wave nodes can distribute inertia faster than the speed of light between the nodes in that array. Why sacred space enable telepathy, for example. They're little miniature stargates, those sacred nodes. Oh yeah, thank you, Jason. So here's the array. The Earth grid, the zodiac, the universe are all arranged dodecahedrally, not just because the golden ratio in that dodecaecosa is fractal, but because not just because that's the only way to stabilize gravity, but because that charge distribution efficiency enabled by the dodeca golden ratio nature of that array is how action at a distance and the physics of coincidence is possible. And that gets us back to this real fundamental understanding now of the nature of coincidence. So this is from the article goldenmean.info/coincidence, in which we talk about fractality in time, that you see, once you understand that connection through time is literally only a matter of charge coupling at a distance, literally resonance, between spin rates. So if the spin rate here is phase locked, embedded with the spin rate over there at a distance, that linking between the two spins electrically coupled spins, is the only possible physics of coincidence. Now, later in this conversation, when we see that the best way to electrically couple two spin rates is if golden ratio is involved, because it allows the little spin to exist inside the bigger spin non-destructively, that linking of the little spin to the big spin, perfected by golden ratio, enables coincidence specifically because it allows the little spin over here to connect to the bigger spin over there. Like golden ratio is how you exist inside the mind of God, because that's non-destructive compression. So we're beginning to get the idea that the physics of coincidence, enabled coincidence, is when little spins can charge couple with bigger spins. And the charge coupling is enabled by the fractality perfected, which is golden mean ratio. That's an introduction to why golden ratio not only is a solution to fractality in space, but also in time. Literally a spiral calendar or a fractal calendar. And that is where we're going with this conversation. But I wanted to get even more practical than that. Well, first, any questions so far, Jason, or how am I doing, do you think?
Yeah, can we explain the node? The node point.
What is the node? Okay, that's a good question. So Jason is holding the model here. Wait, let's put this over here. Okay, so yes, Jason saying, well, let's say more about what is the node point. Yeah, Do we know what it is?
Where on Earth would a node point be?
Yeah, and that's very appropriate to get practical. What we're saying here is that when most electromagnetics propagate as transverse waves up and down, and they don't have the capability of action at a distance. But when electromagnetic fields are compressed at a node, a larger part of the electromagnetic inertia departs in a columnated way and changes then from a transverse up and down to a compressional, we're going to see animations in a minute, called longitudinal electromagnetic. And the compressional component of that longitudinal electromagnetic, sometimes called scalar or torsional, actually then only can then again exchange inertia with the transverse up and down electromagnetics, where they again bounce into compression. So if I take the length of that sine wave, whatever it is, and squirt that in all directions, first it forms a tetracubic lattice structure, but then in a tetracubic array, there is no center point, there is no golden ratio, there is no implosion, there is no centripetal force, there's nothing to hold it to center. So if I'd like to have the centripetal force, which for example is named gravity in that array, this is how hydrogen was invented by God, as it were, that I then have to tilt that tetracube and rotate at 32 degrees, blink 5 times, rotate, and that cube embeds in pentadodeca, the nodes of the array, why the Earth's grid sacred sites are dodecaecosa, because those are the still points which enable the compression to bounce at all these nodes and still create centripetal force, enabling the array to have a center of gravity and thus not get pushed around. And that's true both of your aura and the Earth's aura. So the still points in that array are where the compressional nodes keep bouncing always back to the same place. Why Bruce Cathy measured a reduction in nuclear critical mass at the sacred sites, the Earth grid cross points. Why Kozyrev measured telepathy is enabled at the cross points of magnetic lines. Why labyrinths and cathedrals and therapy and telepathy all work better
On
the wave node.
on a sacred site.
Where the waves cross.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is an introduction. We have some pictures of that, but we wanted to give a very practical flavor to this conversation. Like, can you imagine feeling this for yourself? And I'd like to tell you the story of our first really intense experience of Agnihotra. We were in Poland at the Homa Center, which is their name for Agnihotra. And let's see, I need my copper pyramid here. Oh, I got it right here. Here we go. Okay. So remember, in the Agnihotra, they put a giant copper pyramid underground. And then you're sitting there with this copper pyramid into which you put the ash, and well, first you start with ghee, and you're burning ghee, which creates a plasma flame, and you light that plasma flame. Now there's a plasma flame, the burning ghee, and here is the pyramid, which is implosive capacitance, literally the dish in which you light the Agnihotra fire. Now the point is that as we're sitting there in Poland, in this center in Poland is literally a Garden of Eden in a desert. So all the way around there's farmers that are dying. But here, the little area where they've been doing Agnihotra twice a day for years, it is the most incredible green paradise. And they tell you specifically why it is, because they've been doing Agnihotra there. And the Agnihotra is well credited with reducing those who died at Nagasaki, and where the nuclear explosion was. It actually saved the radioactive deaths of many people. And Agnihotra is credited with saving many people at Bhopal in India also.
Okay.
So this is creating a centripetal plasma field which is somehow stabilizing life. Now, how is it doing that? And I'm using this as an example for us to begin to understand fractality and time specifically. And here's my explanation. So there we're sitting there in this special little tower in Poland, and he's about ready to light the plasma flame. And he's got a computer there that has calculated the exact second, the exact second of sunset. And just as his little computer says, bingo, right then my hair stood right up. was like, oh, my aura just said something important happened. And then he lights the flame just there. And you feel this huge rush. Now, I ask you to consider to yourself, what is the physics of why that works so much better precisely at sunrise and sunset? And I show you this picture. Here we go. There's the picture. So sunrise and sunset creates a perpendicular relationship on the Earth's surface with the sun's plasma with the local plasma. Now that is a timing relationship. That's literally, I mean, if I were to draw a picture of how you arrange lasers to meet to make phase conjugation, there it is, the picture of Agnihotra plasma at the cross point of the two magnetic lines. So there's this rush across the Earth's surface at sunrise and sunset when the precise perpendicularity enables the pine cones to get noses in the accurate array geometry called phase conjugation, which is tetracubic, rectilinear, and all that good stuff. So that is an example of the shorter wave, the local plasma flame, with the longer wave, the plasma flame of the sun. And if you embed them, suddenly you get this rush of centripetal force. So that's an example of coming into phase with the longer wave, which is enabled by that, the beginning and introduction of fractality time. Now, supposing I were to do that, sunrise, sunset, also at equinox and solstice, there's a longer wave on the longer wave. Now suppose, always right angle, always tetracubic. Now supposing I was to do that when the solar system suddenly got into the right angle alignment with the galactic equator. A longer wave on a longer wave. Yeah, you're beginning to get the idea that the leverage you get on that still point in the center of that plasma array depends how many waves are converging to constructively implode at that still point node. So Agnihotra is a pretty good introduction to fractality in time, a way to practically experience this. So back to Jose Argüelles. He called this the harmonic convergence. And by the way, it's not the harmonica virgins. No, it's the harmonic convergence. You know, I was on television in Niagara Falls on the day of the first harmonic convergence. The news media, they didn't quite get it right. But what Jose meant by harmonic convergence, you see, if you are an electrical engineer like me, dealing only really with physics, the only possible serious meaning of the perfected harmonic convergence is specifically the electrical convergence of charge waves which produce implosion, literally stillness. We have a lifetime of evidence this is precisely the problem only solved by golden ratio fractal phase conjugation, literally the fusion solution. So fractal phase conjugation based on golden ratio, literally caduceus of Hermes, is the perfection of what Jose Argüelles called harmonic convergence. And we're going to see fractality in time. So this produces the negentropy, which is the subject and title of my book, Origin of Biological Negentropy. Our task here is to understand what that means for the physics of time. The implication is because this charge compression implosion solution produces the ultimate form of wave connectivity, the ultimate form of wave connectivity, the perfect connectivity solution. What do we do after the internet? Oh, we need perfect connectivity if we want to enter heaven, if we want to survive death. So in this dodecafractal array generated by the resulting longitudinal EMF distribution, we get that array, the solution to connectivity. It's literally Mother Nature's internet. It's literally DNA radio. It's literally the weft and woof of stargates across the galaxy. That longitudinal array of nodes. Therefore, this is the ultimate network of mindfulness, the collective unconscious, so-called Hey Ave heaven, where the breath of charge, Hey Ave takes flight, Plains of Sharon, Champs-Élysées. It is therefore the solution to coincidence, and this is what we want to understand deeply. It is a solution to coincidence because it enables the charge coupling, do you see? Coincidence, which is simply a name for charge coupling enabled by these embedded rotations. Oh, here's a picture, which we call time star, goldenmean.info/time star. Do you see how that looks like a time star? Which define what time is charge spin rate, and the embeddability of those time spin rates define fractality in time and the possibility of coincidence. So that sets up a little bit of science for the background for our fun conversation today. This is from our friend John Martineau's book, The Little Book of Coincidences, and he makes a graphic of the orbit of Venus in respect to the orbit of Earth, and everybody knows the reverse retro pent is actually embedded pentagrams, literally pent implosion. And this is not just the geometry of the relationship of Venus and Earth, but, as you'll see in the table we're about to see, Earth year, galactic year, precessional year, they all have that same geometric embeddability, stabilizing fractality, because that is fractality in time. So this brings us to our friend Geoff Stray, who we knew quite well. He's really worked hard on this. And he was, along with many people, if you do a Google search on fractal time and the Mayan calendar, you're going to get, a lot of conversation, which is good. But some of us really tried to put physics to that, and Geoff Stray started on that. So he took the key time intervals, and these he has in his book Beyond 2012, part 4, he actually shows the major turning points in all the galactic history between the origin of the Mayan calendar, it was called the bifurcation point 11,000 years ago. 12,000 years ago, everybody knows it relates to the Dryad, the Great Flood, and all, there's a leveraged turning point there. And if you take golden ratio in time from that point, you get this beautiful picture, literally, of a spiral calendar. And there's a connection between these turning points in time, which is what Geoff Stray is saying in his book. And so there's many drawings made of this spiral in time and the spiral calendar. And so this is beginning, and even they're talking about the photon belt and the photon cloud, which we now know is major alignment of the solar system with the galactic equator, and that has a greater amount of inertia and charge and dust, and the galactic equator then increases the compression on the solar system, sometimes called the rapture. And so this is, again, alignment of a short wave and a longer wave in a spiral calendar. Now, actually, in the book Spiral Calendar, about fractality in time, Carol Ann famously introduced also how this applies to the stock market. And this became one of the bases for my stock market prediction software, which shows when you get harmonic coherence in these harmonic cascades, you can actually predict the stock market. And that's famously the fractalwave.works, which originally worked for my goldenmean.info/stock market, and you can see all that on the web. It's pretty fun stuff. So in Shine Richards, originally, he was an old friend there, he developed all these charts of golden ratio in the solar system between the planetary orbitals, and we have some graphics on that. And so this is a picture of how that flame is lit by golden ratio fractality in time, initiating compression at certain wave nodes in time where you get more leverage on that array. So it shouldn't be called really a day out of time, but it's more actually a day maximally embedded in time. It's a 0 point in the sense that the most number of waves has converged non-destructively at that point, literally a harmonic convergence, and that's an implosion in time and giving you leverage on the array.
Is that also merging of timelines?
Yes, so see, Jason is going to be doing a presentation for us tomorrow, hopefully, or when we get ambitious or when we get younger.
Yeah.
and he's appropriate. What about merging of timelines? So there's going to be a part 2 to this video series, more about the physics of time travel, for example. And the extraterrestrials are said, many say, for example, Michael Salla and Elena Danaan say, the ETs have used time travel to fight the war here for the solar system. And we need to understand this. For example, in terms of convergence of timelines, purportedly, the Andromedans were said, many reports, starting with Alex Collier, that they saw a wave of radiating chaos spreading through this galactic sector 300 years in our future. They traveled back in time to find out where the wave of radiating chaos was propagating through our galactic quadrant, and they saw the mess started on Earth. When? Well, about the time when Eisenhower MJ12 really, signed the treaty with the wrong ETs, the Nebu. And then millions of humans were abducted. And the Germans, took over South Pole, and things got messier and messier and messier. And so suddenly the Galactic Federation, led originally by the Zenate, the Andromedans, arrives back here, because not only, they weren't just saving the solar system. No. This quarter of the galactic sector, this was a timeline travel that enabled them to see this. They had to save this whole galactic quadrant. So they sent their fleet back here, and they, in the last 2 years, pretty much booted the Greys and the Dracos out of first the South Pole, and then the deep underground military bases, think Area 51. And then they booted the Greys, Dracos, and Nebus out of Moon and Mars, and even Ceres, the moon on of Jupiter that was infested, we believe, or they believe, by the Dark Fleet, basically the Nazi fleet. The Nazi Bell. We're going to do that story in part 2. Yep. But that is an example of Jason's questions. Well, is that an example of converging timelines? So when they came back here, it was because time travel had been used parasitically. And we need to understand that. The German Dark Fleet, for example, had extensively used time travel to gather resources when they parasitically used slavery, et cetera, to take over their base on Mars. And so it was very messy. And that time travel coming back in time to fix this mess also relates directly to why Thoth Hermes returned with the 9 in the Intergalactic Federation, which Elena Denon talked about and we have made some films about. And that was led by Thoth Hermes, who is from the only planet of choice, whose symbol was the caduceus, who came back here with the cedar races to find out if the seeds were growing. So this is a big subject, and we're going to cover some of that. But first, let's do our basics. So we were supposed to go to slide number 7 in this first series. Let's see. We have cause of gravity, window, too many slideshows, too little time here. So slide 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so we're talking about the fractal nature of time. We've looked at that. So what we're supposed to do now is talk about Quetzalcoatl. So remember when Maurice Cotterell wrote his book about the lid of Palenque called The Tutankhamun Prophecies. And he said that the solar time physics of the Mayan lid of Palenque, which is Quetzalcoatl, it was a map of the solar flare periodicities which were preventing ovulation. And we need a picture for this. So we're going to go to, this is goldenmean.info/Carrington event. And this is Maurice Cotterell talking about the fact in Tutankhamun Prophecies. Remember, what his conclusion was that the solar physics behind Viracocha Quetzalcoatl in predicting these patterns in time was proof that this intelligence was identical with Tutankhamun and the Egyptians' lineage named Thothmosis. Thoth, Moesis, sons of Thoth, the names of the Egyptian kings. Okay? And so Maurice Cotterell is saying their solar time physics was identical. Therefore, basically, Quetzalcoatl is the same guy as Thoth. Oh, what a coincidence. And so he's talking about this as the return of the feathered serpent. So, when Jose Argüelles talks about the feathered serpent, Maurice Cotterell is saying the feathered serpent, see the feathering on that wave within a wave of the solar wind density map? So what Maurice Cotterell believed that the lid of Palenque was basically a Macromind director computer animation, if I may say, of the fact that the pattern of the solar wind, literally the feathered serpent, was such that during that epoch, the solar flare patterns were preventing humans from ovulating. It was literally a population disaster. And literally, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, who apparently is Hermes Thoth, who apparently is the Nine, who apparently is the Cedar Races, who apparently is literally the father of the Black Madonna, who apparently is the father of all the Egyptian kings, who apparently is whom Atlantis was named for, who apparently is who Thule was named for, is basically apologizing and saying, well, solar flare pattern changed, ovulation inhibited, bye. So the relationship of the compression pattern of the star plasmas to human fertility is the issue being studied by Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, Thoth, and the Hermetic tradition. And that's what the fractality in time is about. So just to look, so that relationship was called the Earth-centered cross in the cube of space. And this is from Vincent Bridges, primarily with Jay Widener, in Mysteries of the Great Cross of Henday, except this is a really great cross. And that is the cube of space there. You see the Draco star at the top and the south ecliptic pole at the bottom. So this is literally a cube of space. And here's an animation of the relationship of the Earth equator with the solar equator with the galactic equator. And when these equators nutate and precess, so on the bottom left, Earth equator, solar equator, galactic equator. When these equators nutate and precess, they form the great cube of space at that certain cross point. And that could be called a day out of time, actually. And that compression starts with that compression at the center is tetracubic. There's the tetracube coming out right there. There's the tetracube. You see, but the tetracube is at the center of the dodecaecosa. And the nutation precession animated in the top left is the fact that as I pump that gyroscope, and it takes all the muscle in my arm to pump that spin, I'm engaging in a phase lock between planetary spin, solar spin, and zodiacal spin. And here's the long wave, the precession nutation, pumping the speed of the short wave. And that phase lock between Earth spin, solar spin, and zodiacal spin has to be locked into phase gyroscopically, idealized by golden ratio, to enable that implosive relationship of coupled spin between the long wave and the short wave, which only golden ratio allows. And that's not just the stabilization of gravity, but the stabilization of entropy within the solar system, literally mind. And here we see how that array functions as instant propagation, because the billiard balls, when they're all locked into an array, you touch one, a billion billiard balls down the array of dodecaecosa will pop off that grid. That's a fast communicator. And so this is showing when 1 million children sang the same song on the planet, it was measured 11 times that the solar flares went, ah. and this is clearly, this is part of the whale dreamer story, and we should credit our friend who made that measurement, published in Borderland Sciences. I should put that in here. It's, but so the physics is that the solar system, for example, needs the centripetal force enabled by the collective dreaming, in this case of the children. And the reason the solar flares were so dramatically affected when 1 million children sang the same song, the sun's sitting there saying, when is this gene pool going to wake up and get centripetal so stars can be born? So this is the story of solar wind and the Carrington event. Okay, so now the next part of this we're supposed to talk about was, we talked about the Lida-Palenque scalar physics, solar habit, and Cotterell and Carrington. Okay. So what do you think, Jason, so far? How are we doing?
Good.
We haven't confused everyone yet, right? So we're getting now to some of the more esoteric material about fractality and time, which has to do with time travel and how there are nodes in the array of time. So now we're going to go back to our slideshow, and here's where we left off the slideshow. So that you saw that, in fact, the golden ratio series is all over the geometry of the solar system. That's old news. Everyone knows that planetary orbital mechanics are dominated by golden ratio because that fractality of spin is the cause of gravity and all centripetal forces, including fractality in time. And that's the specialty of the website spirosolaris.ca, where you see these gorgeous pictures. So that leads us to the idea of where magnetic lines converge using golden ratio. This is called phase conjugate magnetics, which is a concept I invented, although I started here at the top right with Elizabeth Rausch's famous data from these are the magnetic frequencies that elicited pain in her FDA trials. And these are the peaks of the magnetic harmonics. And this is the predicted cascade of Planck times golden ratio, which I identified in her healing cascade. And at that point, she said, well, you're right. You've invented phase conjugate magnetics. And here's an example of magnets arranged in a dodeca and conjugating, actually. So that frequency recipe became, and here's in purple, Therify.net, implosive magnetics, not just in space and in time. Here's the frequencies here, 3, 10, 32, and 80, which Priori used, approximating, which led me to understand the physics, which he did not, that phase conjugation tuned to Planck was the principle behind Priori's famous ability to heal so many people with plasma, and that became Therify.net, which is now functioning in 25 countries. And that is fed by the software, flameinmind.com, Flame in Sound, the Bliss binaural, which feeds 4 other technologies we're going to talk about. So here are the phase conjugate pine cones kissing noses, which is really a picture of how phase conjugate lasers work. And here is an example of that working in mindfulness, that if you do that figure 8 cross crawl called infinity walk, there's a dramatic reduction measured in dyslexia. And the reason is you've obviously phase conjugated, imploded those rotations, making a fractal in space and time, and that generated centripetal force is demonstrated a dramatic solution to, for example, dyslexia in the book by our famous friend Deborah Sunbeck called Infinity Walk. So that's an example of these 4 pine cones kissing noses to implode and conjugate. So in terms of Jason's earlier question about what are the nodes, the inertia information of the longitudinal wave's energy in general only becomes available at the nodes or compression still points. A day out of time, a still point, a compression point. The still or node point in the array initially forms tetracubically. But for the array to become non-destructive and stable in 3D, for it to become centripetal and have a center of gravity, that tetracube needs to embed into the next dimension, dodecaecosa, because only that generates golden ratio, constructive interference, implosive compression, and centering force, gravity, and negentropy. So the array ultimately stabilizes as dodecaecosa, which is wrapped around tetracubes. We're going to see that later in brainwaves. We have this octave cascade and then golden ratio cascades in brainwaves. And when the children who see without their eyes, and when Jean-Charles Mayan, the moment his lucid dream became a portal, we measured that, and indeed you get the octave cascade in brainwaves and the golden ratio cascade in brainwaves, all centered on his alpha. And so that means the tetracube has embedded in dodecaecosa, and the implosion is now stable, and that centripetal force is the moment his left eye and right eye saw where he's coming from and going to, and he literally made a portal with his own body. And we measured the brainwave signature. That's our recent film with Jean-Charles Mayan, the secret space program experiencer from France. So most sound wave energy travels longitudinally, but most of the electromagnetic waves we know how to use as transverse. Under conditions of ordered or phase conjugate compression, then electromagnetic flux can propagate in a longitudinal array, sometimes called scalar, and the inertia component becomes available again only at the array nodes, the still points, the day out of time. So that's why sacred sites enable telepathy and labyrinths and cathedrals and therify and action at a distance, because those nodes or still point are places where you get leverage on the array because the compression nodes touch the longitudinal. So this is the slide you've seen before about how the longitudinal energy is generated. The transverse electromagnetic on the left enters the perfect vortex, travels in a spiral down the pine cone called the caduceus, phase conjugation, and it spits out at a squirt gun, literally the toothpaste tube's mouth diameter is Planck, and the Planck threshold tunes the longitudinal array. Remember, longitudinal electromagnetics define gravity waves in Bearden's equations. So this is how gravity waves are made, and this is directly the reason gravity exists, because this is how hydrogen is making gravity, a centripetal force. And these are our published equations and papers on this. Fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. So we want to differentiate the array that's created. This is, if you take my equation called origin of negentropy, which is Planck length or time times golden ratio, integer exponents of golden ratio, you see this array starts with hydrogen radii, ATP, photosynthesis, sacred foot, the units of dimension, Schumann harmonics, brainwave harmonics, Mayer wave, Venus year, Earth year, precession year, galactic year. They all obey the equation Planck times integer exponents golden ratio. That is an array. It's a big array. Actually, there was a precedent for that story. Here is Nassim Haramein. Actually, this is the mathematics from Elizabeth Rauscher, which she told me. But they took the frequency versus radius of the Big Bang, which is basically Planck, the atom, the solar system, the galaxy, and the intergalaxy, and the universe, and plotted frequency versus radii. Very simple. So here is the universe. It's a big radius. And here's the Big Bang. It's a small radius. Now, if you take the nodes on that plot, frequency versus radius, the ratio between them, Big Bang here, Planck, and the universe here, the ratio, and here's the atom, but the ratio here is golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio. So golden ratio is all over that plot. That's Nassim Haramein, which is a precedent to what we did later. We took specifically golden ratio multiples of Planck and got hydrogen, etc. Another example of that array is how the human body embeds during bliss, where the Schumann harmonics are up top, and the brainwave harmonics and the sacrocranial harmonics, they all again obey my equation, Planck times golden ratio, in this plot of my equation done by Patrick Botti. So we embed in that array and we get leverage. This is a longer wave example that if you take, this is from realheartcoherence.com, if you take the heart rate of persons who are stuck in their head, their heart rate is 1 second, whereas the heart rate of persons who are touchy-feely and feeling love is higher, 0.618 seconds. And it turns out that you get leverage on the array literally with your heart rate also. But a more direct conversation about that array, which leads us, I think we'll do in a part 2 to this film. But you see, you know that if you're time traveling, even if you're using a portal for just space travel, peak emotions determine where you land in the array. So they create anchor points in the array. Later we're going to talk about how Montauk had 20-year anchor points in the time travel array. Jason will speak to that in part 2. But here I want to talk about how and why peak emotions act as anchor points in the array for portal travel and time travel. And to understand that, I'd like to present my friend Manfred Klein's Centix work, discussed at goldenmean.info/touch and microsoundmusic.com, his website. And so Manfred, as you know, he had tens of thousands of persons, and they would feel joy, and they would touch a button on a spring, and then he'd make a graph of the change in pressure over time of the touch that said joy versus anger versus hate versus love. And thousands of people did this, Centix cycles. And then I did something he did not do, is I plotted the ratios. And what I showed here was that if you take the beginning of the event of touch and the end of the event of touch and the midpoint of max pressure in that touch, you'd have a simple ratio. And that ratio for joy was 1/6, repeatedly. Where anger was 1/7, destructive wave interference. Whereas love was tantrically delayed, the hug that says, I love you, you wait during the process of hugging that person. If you want to say, I love you, you must wait until 0.618 into the duration of your love hug, tantrically. And then you set up that ratio, 0.618, golden ratio, and that sends an implosive quiver through that array, and you ask your experimental huggee, did you feel a tingle in your DNA? And you find out if your love hug was electrically effective. There. Have we added the romance? But you see, if there were peak emotions in a place in that array, now we're talking about the physics of how ghosts get stuck. We're talking about the physics of why Therify.net plasma system is so famous for releasing stuck ghosts. So these massive centripetal points in the array, dominated by intense emotion, create anchor points. And this is going to talk about our science of time travel later. Now, I think we're going to do this in part 2. In part 2 here, we're going to show that the harmonic series of the 53 hertz versus 50 hertz we measured at the pyramids, for example, and then the 28 kilohertz versus 26 kilohertz measured in Bosnia, that this differentiated two types of arrays, that basically tetracubic versus the implosive, later the Metatronic versus Orotronic, which is the Templar agenda of the repair of fabric of time. And that's going to get us talking about what happened at Montauk in terms of the bleeding in the fabric of time caused by the time travel projects at Philadelphia and Montauk, which led to the koala experiment of the repair of the fabric of time from the Templars and William Buehler, who talked about this orotronic versus metatronic grid, which is a centripetal array, metatronic pent, versus a hex array, octave golden ratio, called orotronic. And that begins to get us into this conversation about
time travel.
Well, yes, about time travel and about how Earth was isolated.
Oh, okay, yes. Yeah, understood, yeah.
You spoke about that Earth actually became isolated in the array because there's kind of like a bubble.
Yeah, so it was Admiral Byrd during Operation High Jump 2 was down in Antarctica digging down, and he hit the dome, supposedly. Now, that dome is not a physical, like, glass dome, as in the Simpsons movie. That is, Dan could take over from here.
The idea is that the plasma bubble of the solar system, in this case, particularly the Earth, is dominated by a harmonic series. So that in membrane theory, for example, is called structural stability and morphogenesis, that the membrane of a cell creates an immune system if it's harmonic inclusive. Well, it turns out that octave harmonics create more spherical membranes, and golden ratio harmonics create implosive membranes. And when the Andromedan and the Federation needed to trap the Dracos and the Greys in the solar system, they put these nuclear generators in the hollow metal artificial moon, and they amplified not just the amplitude of the Van Allen belts, which trapped them in here at that time, but that created a frequency quarantine or frequency fence, which is literally this bubble. And that's the idea that we kind of get out of this bubble, and this relates to the idea of going to the next dimension or the rapture, when more implosive compression is enabled in our neighborhood.
Yeah, and we'll talk about how to get to that point. One is fixing the Earth grid, and two is fixing the fractality of time, which is, we could even say that what we're doing here on Earth is preventing the entire galaxy from ascending, you could say.
That there's, because another meaning to vaccine in the Orion Wars here is the sense that if we discover how to get fractal or get dead, perfect embeddability, this allows the whole region of this galactic sector to unpack and unfold. And this gives a new meaning to the physics of ascension, which is literally when your plasma bubble can embed in a wider series of harmonics for that golden ratio embeddability, but that requires you to become a shareable wave.
Exactly. And you could go back to that graphic that you always show of our the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy that we're in is fractionated. Everyone else is okay. We're fractionated. So that's why they sent the fleets here to fix that problem.
The Reverend Mothers, when we were young, said, if you look up and see the Orion sectors, that the Orion arm of our galaxy looks like it's broken. And the Reverend Mothers always says, well, that's because we blew up too many star systems in the Orion Wars. And Elena Danana has given us a better idea what those Orion Wars were. But the sense of restoring fractality in time is restoring fractality in these spin patterns, which enable this embeddability and enable us to participate in the larger and larger arrays of these higher dimensions. But that's the conversation for part 2. So I think we'll say this is it for part 1. Thank you, Jason. And to be continued, the advanced time travel physics, science of Montauk, the William Bueller Templar agenda of the repair of the fabric of time. We will get into that more in part 2. Thank you very much. Blessings.